Clint Eastwood stepped into the auction hall, unfazed by the sea of millionaires, until a sleek, diamond-draped socialite scoffed, "This isn't a rodeo, old man." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. She thought she had the upper hand. Clint didn't argue. He just smiled. Because by the end of the night, he wouldn't just beat her, he'd ruin her. What happened next left the entire room stunned. Stay till the end. This is a showdown you won't forget. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The grand auction hall buzzed with quiet murmurs and the occasional clink of champagne glasses. Under the glow of crystal chandeliers, the room was a sea of tailored suits, glittering gowns, and the unmistakable air of old money. The kind of place where power wasn't just about wealth, it was about reputation. Clint Eastwood stepped inside, his presence in instant contrast to the extravagance surrounding him. Dressed in a simple yet sharp brown jacket, dark slacks, and boots that had seen their share of dust, he exuded a different kind of authority. He wasn't here for the show, the gossip, or the pretension. He was here for business. As he strode forward, a few heads turned. Some recognized him instantly, whispering to their companions. Others, particularly those too young to understand the weight of his name, simply saw an older man who, in their eyes, didn't belong. One of them was Victoria Langston. Victoria, a tall woman with icy blue eyes and a designer gown that cost more than most people's mortgages, arched an eyebrow the moment she spotted Clint. Her lips curled into an amused smirk as she leaned toward her circle of equally well-dressed socialites. "Isn't he a little outdated for a place like this?" she mused, ensuring her voice carried just enough for people nearby to hear. Soft laughter rippled through the group. Clint, standing just a few feet away, heard every word. He didn't react, didn't flinch. He'd been in the presence of people like Victoria before, people who mistook arrogance for class. But Victoria wasn't content with just whispers. She stepped forward, blocking his path with a deliberate, almost theatrical movement. "You sure you're in the right place, cowboy?" she asked, her tone dripping with amusement. "I mean, this isn't some dusty saloon where you can gamble away your last few dollars." Clint finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. His gaze was calm, steady, and yet it had the effect of making the air between them feel heavier. "That depends," he said, his voice low and measured. "What exactly are we bidding on today?" Victoria chuckled, exchanging glances with her friends before flashing him a patronizing smile. "A mansion you could never afford," she replied smoothly. Clint didn't blink. He simply smiled. But it wasn't the smile of a man who had been put in his place. It was the smile of a man who had just decided to enjoy the rest of his evening. And that was the moment the game truly began. The auction hall buzzed with anticipation as guests adjusted their cufflinks and whispered behind gloved hands. The chandeliers above cast a warm golden glow, reflecting off champagne glasses and polished jewelry. Waiters moved seamlessly between the guests, offering refills and hors d'oeuvres, but all eyes were already drifting toward the main attraction of the evening, the mansion up for sale. Victoria Langston moved through the room with the effortless grace of someone who had never been told no. She carried herself like royalty, her designer gown hugging her frame, diamonds at her neck catching the light with every calculated movement. Her smirk hadn't faded since her exchange with Clint, and now she was in her element, commanding attention, basking in admiration, and setting the tone for the auction. She made a point to glide past groups of potential bidders, sizing them up like a lioness eyeing prey. When a young businessman, barely in his 30s, hesitated as the auctioneer announced the starting bid, Victoria pounced. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, her voice carrying across the room. "If you're that scared of a number, maybe stick to apartments." A few muffled chuckles followed, but most people just looked away, uncomfortable. The young man flushed, adjusting his tie, but ultimately lowered his paddle, retreating from the bid. Victoria's expression was victorious. Clint watched, arms loosely crossed, his face unreadable. He had seen her type before. People who mistook wealth for worth, power for character. He let her little performance continue, knowing that people like her always went too far eventually. It didn't take long. An older couple sat near the middle of the room, quietly discussing a potential bid between themselves. The woman, elegantly dressed but with warmth in her features, glanced at her husband, who gave a small, encouraging nod. Victoria, sharp as ever, noticed. "Now I know you two have lovely taste," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness. "But you should really consider something more appropriate. something with fewer stares. The husband's face tightened, his wife's expression falling. They hesitated then, just like the young businessman, lowered their paddle. Victoria turned back, satisfied, when her eyes landed on Clint. He was still there, still calm, still watching. She scoffed, making a show of noticing him, as if she had forgotten all about him. "You're still here?" she asked, tilting her head. "I figured you'd be outside parking someone's car by now." This time, a few guests laughed more freely, emboldened by Victoria's confidence. Clint didn't react immediately. He simply took a slow breath, as if considering whether or not her words were even worth acknowledging. Then his lips parted slightly, and with that same quiet, unwavering tone, he finally spoke. "Nah," he said, tilting his head just slightly. "Just waiting to see how bad you embarrass yourself." The laughter died, the room went silent, and for the first time that night, Victoria had no immediate comeback. The room, still tense from Clint's last remark, slowly came back to life as the auctioneer tapped the microphone, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice smooth but commanding, "we now begin bidding on tonight's crown jewel, an estate unlike any other. A rare architectural masterpiece perched on 5 acres of pristine land." A massive screen behind him displayed sweeping aerial footage of the property, rolling green hills, a private lake shimmering under the sun, the mansion itself a blend of timeless luxury and modern sophistication. The crowd murmured in approval, but all eyes weren't on the screen. They were on Clint and Victoria. Victoria sat up straighter, her polished nails tapping rhythmically against her champagne glass. This was her moment, her playground. She was born for rooms like this, trained to dominate them, and there was no way she'd let some washed-up cowboy make a fool of her. "The bidding starts at $5 million, the auctioneer declared. Before he even finished his sentence, Victoria lifted her paddle. 5.5, she said smoothly, flashing Clint a saccharine smile. The confidence in her voice was unmistakable. The room hushed, waiting. Most bidders knew better than to go against her. Her wealth wasn't just money, it was influence, history, power. She didn't win auctions, she erased competition. A pause stretched, a moment where it seemed like she'd already won. Then Clint raised a single finger. 6. The gasps rippled like a wave across the room. Heads turned. Whispered conversations broke out. Victoria's smirk faltered, only for a second. Then she let out a soft, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "You must be joking," she said, her voice light, but her eyes sharp. Clint leaned back in his chair, completely unbothered. "I don't joke about things I can buy." The auctioneer, sensing the shift in energy, pressed forward. "We have $6 million from Mr. Eastwood. Do I hear 6.5? Victoria, determined to regain control, lifted her paddle again. 7. Clint didn't hesitate. 8. The tension thickened. A murmur spread through the audience. Nobody had ever seen Victoria actually pushed in a bidding war before. Her fingers tightened around her paddle. 9. Clint didn't blink. 10. The auctioneer's breath hitched slightly. "We have reached 8 figures, ladies and gentlemen." All eyes were now locked on Victoria. She hesitated. For the first time, she hesitated. The tension in the room thickened as murmurs spread like wildfire. The ultra-wealthy bidders, once lounging comfortably in their plush seats, now sat up with intrigue. Clint Eastwood was actually outbidding Victoria Langston. A man known for his quiet confidence was now making waves in a world where arrogance ruled. Victoria's lips curled into a smug smile, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed her irritation. She was used to controlling rooms like this, used to people folding under her presence, too intimidated to challenge her authority. But Clint? He didn't seem fazed at all. He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, as if this were just another ordinary day. That made her angrier. With a dramatic toss of her blonde curls, Victoria laughed, ensuring the sound carried across the auction hall. "Oh, honey," she crooned, turning toward the audience for effect. "Just because you played a cowboy doesn't mean you own land." A few of her sycophants chuckled, but the joke fell flat against the growing curiosity in the room. Clint barely moved. He simply lifted his bidding card again. 8 million! Gasps echoed throughout the hall. The auctioneer, a man used to high stakes, cleared his throat and nodded. "We have 8 million from Mr. Eastwood." Victoria's nails dug into her palm as she forced another smirk. 9. Clint barely blinked before responding. 10. The murmurs turned into outright whispers. This wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a battle, and the entire room was here for it. The people who had dismissed Clint as an aging relic were now seeing him in a different light. Victoria hesitated. That pause, just a fraction of a second, was enough for the audience to sense something unusual. She was always quick with her bids, always ready to assert her dominance. But now, her hesitation sent a ripple through the crowd. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses, sensing the shift in power. We've reached 8 figures, ladies and gentlemen. Any higher? The spotlight was now on Victoria. Her fingers trembled slightly as she glanced toward her assistant, a young man in a sharp suit who subtly shook his head. Her funds were stretched. She had a financial limit, and Clint was pushing her straight toward it. Clint, still completely unbothered, rested an elbow on the chair's armrest, watching her with the patience of a predator waiting for his prey to realize it was trapped. Victoria clenched her jaw, hiding the growing panic beneath her icy exterior. 10 million going once, the auctioneer called, scanning the room. She took a slow breath, buying herself a moment to think. Could she really let Clint Eastwood take this from her? Going twice, Victoria's fingers curled around her bidding paddle, but this time she didn't lift it. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. Last chance, Miss Langston. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line as she felt the weight of the room shift entirely against her. The once amused whispers of the ultra-wealthy elite had turned into full-blown murmurs of shock. The infamous Victoria Langston, known for outbidding anyone who dared challenge her, was struggling, but she wasn't done yet. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her posture, flicked her perfectly styled golden waves over her shoulder, and raised her chin. If she was going to win, she needed to make a statement. And what better way than to crush Clint Eastwood in front of an audience that thrived on drama? 15 million, she declared, her voice ringing through the hall like a gavel striking its final verdict. The collective gasp from the spectators was immediate. Some people clapped in amusement, others leaned forward, eager to see how Clint would react. Even the auctioneer, a man who had overseen countless bidding wars, widened his eyes slightly before regaining his composure. Victoria turned her attention back to Clint, flashing him a victorious smile. Well, cowboy, still want to play? The corners of Clint's mouth twitched, not in frustration, but in sheer amusement. He reached for the small auction paddle resting beside him, lifted it just slightly, and spoke with the same calm confidence he had carried since the moment he walked in. 20! The room exploded. Gasps, hushed exclamations, even laughter rippled through the hall. A few businessmen exchanged impressed nods, and socialites whispered behind gloved hands, eyes darting between Clint and Victoria like spectators at a high-stakes poker game. Victoria's smile faltered. Her fingers tightened around the bidding paddle, but her mind was already racing. She hadn't expected him to keep going. She turned slightly, looking toward her assistant, a thin, well-dressed man who had been standing silently at her side throughout the evening. Desperation flashed in her eyes as she subtly waved for him to act, to do something. But instead of responding, her assistant simply shook his head. A cold wave of realization washed over her. She had reached her financial limit. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest, though she masked it well beneath an icy glare. She couldn't bid again, not unless she wanted to explain to her financial advisors why she had just recklessly gambled beyond her liquidity. Clint, of course, had noticed. His years of experience, both in Hollywood and real life, had given him an unparalleled ability to read people. And right now, he could see the panic creeping into Victoria's expression, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. The auctioneer, sensing the moment reaching its climax, lifted his gavel high. 20 million going once? Victoria's nails dug into her palm. Going twice. Her breath hitched. The auctioneer paused for the final call. Final bid. Any takers? Victoria clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. Would she risk everything, or let Clint walk away victorious? The auction hall fell into stunned silence as the sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room. Sold to Mr. Eastwood for $20 million, the auctioneer declared, his voice carrying the weight of finality. For a moment, time seemed to pause. Then, as if someone had lifted the veil of disbelief, the entire room erupted into cheers, gasps, and hushed whispers. A few people clapped, some laughed in sheer amazement, while others simply stared in awe. No one, absolutely no one, had expected Clint Eastwood to walk into this. Auction and dethrone Victoria Langston, the so-called Queen of Auctions, except for Clint. He remained still, a quiet confidence resting in his eyes as he watched the reality sink into Victoria's face. She looked like she had been slapped. Her flawless complexion paled as the truth settled in. She had lost. Her carefully curated reputation, the dominance she had wielded over high society auctions, the smug confidence she carried into every bid. All of it had just been shattered in front of the wealthiest elite in the country. For the first time, Victoria Langston was the one being laughed at. She turned sharply on her heel, storming toward Clint, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with each furious step. "You can't actually afford this," she hissed, her voice just loud enough for the surrounding audience to hear. She needed to save face, needed to regain control of the narrative before the damage became irreversible. Clint barely reacted. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and clicked it open with a casual flick of his fingers. "Cash or check, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. A fresh wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone whistled. A businessman near the front smirked and muttered, "Damn, I like this guy." Victoria's jaw clenched so hard that for a moment it looked like she might shatter her own teeth. Her fingers curled into fists, perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. She had spent years perfecting the art of public humiliation, but never once had she been on the receiving end of it. She refused to let this be the end. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed a hand over her gown, plastering a forced, almost sinister smile onto her face. Then she looked at Clint with something new in her eyes, something calculating. "You really think this is over?" she murmured, just loud enough for only him to hear. Clint raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's supposed to be a threat?" Victoria tilted her head, the smirk returning to her lips. "Oh, cowboy. This was just round one." The crowd continued celebrating Clint's victory, unaware that Victoria had already set her backup plan into motion. Whatever she was plotting, Clint could see it coming from a mile away, and he was ready for it. The applause had barely faded before Victoria sprang into action. She wasn't about to let Clint Eastwood walk away with that mansion, at least not without a fight. With her head held high and an air of forced composure, she took a step toward the auctioneer, her voice dropping to a hushed but urgent whisper. "There's been a mistake," she said, her tone deceptively sweet. "I just spoke with the seller, and it turns out this sale isn't final. There's an issue that needs to be resolved." The auctioneer, an older gentleman with decades of experience in high-stakes sales, frowned slightly. "Ms. Langston, the auction has ended. Mr. Eastwood won the bid fair and square." Victoria's smile tightened. "I suggest you verify that with the seller. Right now." There was something in her tone, an unspoken warning, a quiet threat that made the auctioneer hesitate. He glanced toward the stage where Clint remained standing, his arms crossed, watching the exchange with mild amusement. The entire room was still abuzz from the unexpected upset, but now new whispers began to spread. Sensing the attention shifting back to her, Victoria straightened her shoulders and turned to face the audience. With a carefully crafted expression of concern, she raised her voice just enough to be heard. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "I just spoke with the seller. And unfortunately, this deal isn't over yet." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The murmurs turned to outright conversation, people leaning in to whisper theories. Clint exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. He'd seen people play dirty before, but this was something else. The auctioneer cleared his throat, glancing nervously at Victoria before addressing the audience. It it seems there may be a technical issue with the sale," he admitted reluctantly. Clint's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened slightly. He took a slow step forward, the weight of his presence alone enough to make some of the guests instinctively move aside. He tilted his head, regarding Victoria with an almost bored curiosity. "Lady," he said, his voice low and measured, "you're really making this harder for yourself." Victoria met his gaze, her lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, cowboy," she purred. "I haven't even started yet." The crowd leaned in, sensing that the battle wasn't over. Whatever Victoria had up her sleeve, Clint wasn't worried. If she wanted a fight, she had just picked the wrong opponent. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria stood tall, believing she had just thrown an insurmountable obstacle in Clint's way. She basked in the murmurs of the crowd, the uncertainty in the auctioneer's voice, the way everyone leaned in, waiting for the next dramatic turn. She thought she had won. Clint, however, looked entirely unbothered. With the same calm, measured movements that had made him a legend both on and off the screen, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement was so casual that at first no one reacted. That was until he said, "Guess it's time to call in a favor." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Victoria's smugness faltered for a brief second, but she quickly recovered, arms crossed as she watched Clint with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "Who are you calling, old man? Your financial advisor? Maybe a loan officer?" she taunted. Clint ignored her. He scrolled through his contacts, found the number he wanted, and pressed dial. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he tapped the speaker button. The phone rang once, twice. Then a deep, hearty laugh erupted on the other end. "Well, well, if it ain't Clint Eastwood," came the familiar voice. Victoria's expression hardened. She didn't recognize the voice, but something about Clint's smirk told her she was about to. "Hey, Bill," Clint said, his voice steady. "You still selling that mansion?" Dead silence. Then Bill chuckled again, his voice carrying across the room through the speaker. "For you, Clint? Always." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. People turned to each other, eyes widening as realization set in. Bill. Bill as in Bill Prescott, one of the wealthiest private landowners in the country, the actual owner of the mansion, the man who Victoria had been boasting about knowing personally for the past half hour. Victoria's smirk vanished like a candle snuffed out by the wind. "No, that's not possible," she muttered, shaking her head. "Oh, it's possible, sweetheart," Clint said, his gaze locked onto her. "See, I don't waste my time trying to impress people. I just get things done." Bill's voice rang through the phone again. "Clint, tell me you're not dealing with that Langston woman." Clint let out a low chuckle. "Oh, I am. But don't worry. I'm about to make her day real interesting." Victoria's face went pale. She opened her mouth to protest, to argue, to find some way to salvage the situation, but no words came out. The auctioneer fumbled with his microphone, unsure of what to say next. But it didn't matter, because Clint had just bypassed the entire auction process. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came out. Her usual sharp wit and biting remarks had abandoned her, leaving her frozen in place. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She had spent years mastering the art of control, bending situations and people to her will. Yet here she was, standing in front of a crowd of elites who had just witnessed her biggest humiliation. The whispers started softly but grew in intensity, rippling through the auction hall like an approaching storm. Did she really just get outplayed? She was so confident a minute ago. Clint made her look like an amateur. Victoria's fingers curled into fists at her sides. The attention that once fed her ego now burned like a spotlight, exposing every one of her weaknesses. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had orchestrated this event, positioned herself as the dominant force in the room. Clint Eastwood was supposed to be a minor inconvenience, an entertaining distraction at best. But instead he had turned the entire game against her. Finally, she forced out a brittle laugh, though it lacked any real conviction. I was just joking, Clint," she stammered, flipping her hair over her shoulder as if the past few minutes had been nothing but an amusing performance. "Come on, you didn't actually take me seriously, did you?" Clint studied her, his expression unreadable. Then with a slow shrug, he delivered the final blow. "Too bad," he said. "I don't joke about things I can buy." The room erupted. Laughter, applause, gasps. It all blended together into a symphony of Victoria's downfall. She felt her face flush as the people she had once held power over now delighted in her embarrassment. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smirked. But worst of all, some simply looked amused, like they had been waiting for this moment all along. Victoria's throat tightened. She needed to leave. Now, without another word, she turned sharply on her heel, her heels clicking against the marble floor with frantic urgency. The auctioneer didn't bother stopping her. Her assistant scrambled behind her, but she barely acknowledged him. All she could think about was getting out before she completely unraveled in front of everyone. As she shoved the heavy double doors open and stepped into the night, the sound of Clint's voice carried through the air, still rich with amusement. "Careful, sweetheart. Hate to see you trip on your own ego." Clint Eastwood stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone once to silence the airing chatter in the auction hall. The tension from Victoria's dramatic exit still hung in the air, but all eyes were now on him. He scanned the crowd, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. Then he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "You know," he said, voice deep and deliberate, I don't actually need another mansion. A wave of murmurs rippled through the hall. The same crowd that had just cheered his victory now sat in stunned silence, hanging on his every word. A few exchanged puzzled glances. Was he joking? After all that? Clint reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Before I even walked in here tonight, I had a plan. He unfolded the document and held it up. This property won't be going to me. A sharp inhale from the audience filled the space. The murmurs grew louder, and one of the auctioneers leaned forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. Clint turned slightly, looking toward the cameras that had begun recording the moment he won. This mansion, he continued, is being donated in full to the Wounded Warriors Foundation. The room exploded. Gasps, applause, and shocked exclamations filled the air as realization hit. He wasn't just buying a house. He was making a statement. Near the entrance, Victoria Langston, who had been pacing in the hallway in frustration, stopped mid-step. Her manicured nails dug into her palm as she processed what she just heard. No, no, no. This wasn't just a loss. This was humiliation on a global scale. Not only had she been outbid, but Clint had turned the entire event into something bigger than her petty games. Instead of an extravagant personal purchase, he had just made her look small, selfish, and insignificant. Inside the hall, the energy shifted. People who had once been intimidated by Victoria now cheered for Clint. Reporters pushed forward, shoving microphones toward him. Mr. Eastwood, was this your plan all along? Why donate the mansion instead of keeping it? How does it feel knowing you just pulled off the biggest auction twist of the year? Clint simply tipped his head slightly, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Some people buy power, he said. Others earn it. The flash of cameras lit up the room as Victoria, still frozen in the hallway, realized something horrifying. This moment would haunt her reputation forever. The internet had never moved so fast. Within minutes of Clint Eastwood's shocking announcement, social media was on fire. News outlets scrambled to break the story, their headlines flashing across screens worldwide. Clint Eastwood humiliates socialite in historic auction standoff. Victoria Langston outbid, outplayed, and outclassed. Clint Eastwood wins $20 million mansion, then donates it in the ultimate power move. By morning, the footage had gone viral. Clips of Victoria's smug confidence, her dramatic bidding war, and ultimately her stunned silence when Clint revealed his plan were being shared by millions. Memes flooded the internet, mocking her downfall with captions like, "When you flex too hard and get folded instead. Victoria, he could never afford this." Also, Victoria, please, I wasn't serious. Clint didn't just buy the mansion, he bought her entire dignity. In an attempt to salvage her reputation, Victoria rushed to her PR team. She quickly arranged an interview, hoping to spin the story in her favor. Sitting stiffly in front of a pristine white backdrop, she forced a smile for the cameras. "This was all just friendly competition," she insisted, her voice smooth but strained. "Clint Eastwood is a legend, and I have nothing but respect for him. The media loves to exaggerate things, but there was never any real animosity. But the internet wasn't buying it. Underneath every post, the comments were ruthless. Girl, we saw the footage. You were fighting for your life out there. You disrespected him first, and he just played the game better. A friendly competition wouldn't have left you storming out like a sore loser." While Victoria scrambled to regain control of the narrative, Clint remained completely unbothered. He didn't tweet. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't need to. The world had already decided who won. The following evening, at a charity gala, Clint made his first public appearance since the auction. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, eager for a comment. "Mr. Eastwood, did you expect the auction to turn into such a spectacle?" He gave a casual shrug. "Didn't expect anything. Just showed up." "What do you think about Victoria's latest interview, where she claims it was all in good fun?" Clint let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Did she now?" One journalist, emboldened by the moment, leaned in with a smirk. "Any final words for Victoria Langston?" Clint adjusted his jacket, glanced toward the cameras, and smirked. "Yeah," he said, eyes twinkling with amusement. "Better luck next time." The reporters burst into laughter as the mics caught every word. Victoria, watching from home, clenched her jaw, because she knew the whole world had just heard it too. Clint Eastwood adjusted his jacket, his weathered hands moving with the same steady confidence that had defined his entire life. His piercing gaze swept over the room one final time, and then he spoke, his voice calm yet commanding. Some people buy power, others earn it. The words cut through the silence like a gunshot in a desert canyon. The message was clear. Victoria Langston had spent her life using money as a weapon, but real power? That was something she could never buy. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some smirked, others exchanged knowing glances, while a few tried, and failed, to suppress their laughter. The weight of Clint's words hung in the air, a perfect ending to the most unexpected showdown in auction history. The auction house director, still slightly shaken from the spectacle, stepped forward and extended a hand. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice full of admiration, "on behalf of the estate, we sincerely appreciate your participation today. It has truly been an unforgettable event." Clint shook his hand firmly, giving him a respectful nod. "Pleasure doing business." Meanwhile, Victoria stood frozen near the stage, her once flawless composure completely shattered. Her face, usually a mask of arrogance, was now a storm of barely concealed rage and humiliation. The reality of her downfall was setting in fast. She had not only lost the mansion, but also her reputation. Then the final blow came. A well-dressed man, one of the auction house officials, stepped toward her with an apologetic smile. "Ms. Langston," he said carefully, "due to today's events, we regret to inform you that your future participation in our auctions is under review." The room collectively inhaled. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she had no snide remark, no witty comeback. She could feel the judgment in every pair of eyes watching her. Just hours ago, she had been the queen of the auction world. Now, she was just another cautionary tale. Clint, ever the gentleman, didn't spare her another glance. He had said all he needed to say. Instead, he turned toward the grand exit, walking with his signature, slow, deliberate stride. As he passed through the ornate doors, he gave a casual tip of his hat, one final gesture, as if sealing his legacy in that very moment. The moment he disappeared from sight, the internet did what it did best. Within minutes, clips of Clint's final words flooded social media. Memes, reaction videos, and headlines exploded across every platform. Clint Eastwood just ended a socialite's career in 30 seconds, and the most satisfying auction moment of all time trended worldwide. By the time Clint reached his car, his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. "You've still got it, cowboy," he smirked, sliding into the driver's seat. 50 million views, a worldwide scandal, and a lesson Victoria Langston would never forget. Justice, Clint Eastwood style.